Sometimes the kindest hearts are found in the humblest places. When you've lost everything that mattered, all you have left is who you choose to be when nobody's watching. Vera Campbell was down to her last plate of food when a stranger knocked on her door at sundown. The 52-year-old widow didn't have much, but she shared what little she had with the dust-covered cowboy who asked only for water. She never knew that man owned every piece of land she could see. Mitchell Cord was the richest rancher in the territory, but he was tired of people only seeing his money. So he dressed like any other drifter and discovered something he'd forgotten existed, a woman who gave without expecting anything back. But what happens when she finds out the truth about who he really is? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hung low over Willow Bend, like a brass coin suspended in dust, casting long shadows across the weathered buildings that lined the town's single main street. Each shimmered off the packed earth where horses stood with drooping heads, their tails swishing lazily at flies. The drought had been merciless this summer, turning the surrounding grasslands to brittle gold and forcing many a rancher to sell off cattle they couldn't afford to water. Vera Campbell stood on her front porch, wiping her hands on a faded apron that had once been blue, but now held the color of prairie sky after too many washings. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned to find strength in small mercies. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a simple knot, and though lines mapped the corners of her green eyes, they held the warmth of someone who still believed in the goodness of people. The homestead around her told the story of dreams deferred and love lost. The white paint on the modest two-story house had begun to peel, revealing weathered wood beneath. The garden that had once been Samuel's pride now struggled with only the hardiest vegetables surviving her careful rationing of precious well water. The barn leaned slightly to one side, its red paint long since faded to rust, but it still stood firm against the prairie winds. Samuel Campbell had built this place with his own hands 26 years ago, back when they were young and full of plans. He'd promised her they'd have the finest spread in 3 counties, with cattle dotting the hills and children filling the rooms upstairs. The children never came, but their love had grown deeper with each passing season. Rooted in shared labor and quiet evenings on this same porch, now Samuel rested in the small cemetery beyond town, claimed by a fever that had swept through the valley 2 winters past. Vera touched the thin gold chain at her throat, feeling the weight of his wedding ring that she wore there now, close to her heart. Some mornings she still set 2 coffee cups on the kitchen table before remembering she was alone. "Morning, Vera," called Doc Henley as his buggy rattled past, raising a small cloud of dust. The elderly physician tipped his hat, his kind eyes crinkling with concern. He'd been after her to move into town, to take rooms above the millinery shop where Mrs. Patterson could keep an eye on her. But this land held every memory she treasured, every moment of happiness she'd known. She waved back, then turned her attention to the chickens pecking in the yard. At least they still gave her enough eggs to trade at Patterson's general store for flour and coffee. The cow, Bessie, provided milk when the grass hadn't turned too poor. It wasn't much, but it was honest living, the kind Samuel would have been proud of. The morning passed in familiar routines. She collected eggs, checking each nest with gentle hands. In the kitchen, she kneaded dough for the week's bread, her movements practiced and sure. The kitchen had always been her domain, where she felt most capable. Samuel used to say she could make a feast from nothing more than hope and elbow grease. Around noon, Sheriff Tom Briggs stopped by, as he did every few weeks. A bear of a man with a graying mustache and eyes that missed nothing, he'd been Samuel's friend and remained hers. "Afternoon, Vera," he said, settling his considerable frame into one of the porch chairs. "How are you managing?" "Well enough," she replied, bringing him a glass of cool water from the well. "The heat's been hard on everyone." Tom studied her face, noting the weariness she tried to hide. "You know, there's work to be had in town. Mrs. Patterson's been looking for help at the store, and the hotel could use a cook." Vera shook her head gently. "This is my home, Tom. Samuel and I built something here together. I'm not ready to give up on it." The sheriff sighed, understanding but worried. "Pride's a fine thing, Vera, but it won't put food on the table or keep the bank from—" He stopped himself, but the damage was done. The bank? Vera's voice carried a note of fear she couldn't quite hide. Tom's weathered face showed regret for speaking carelessly. "Harrison Steele's been asking questions around town about property values, debt situations. You know how bankers are." Vera knew indeed. Harrison Steele had taken over the Willow Bend Bank after his father's death 3 years ago, and he lacked the elder Steele's compassion for struggling neighbors. She owed them money, not a crushing amount, but more than she could easily manage with her reduced circumstances. After Tom left, Vera sat alone on the porch as afternoon stretched toward evening. The worry gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. Tomorrow's troubles could wait until tomorrow. For now, she had today's blessings to count: a roof over her head, food in her belly, and the knowledge that she'd lived an honest life. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. A lone rider emerged from the heat shimmer, a figure bent with weariness atop a sorrel horse that looked as travel-worn as its master. The stranger reined in at her gate, removing his hat to reveal hair the color of winter wheat, streaked with silver. He was a tall man, probably near her own age, with the kind of face that spoke of years spent under an open sky. His clothes were dusty but well-made, his boots worn but of good leather. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the courteous tone of a man raised to respect women, "I wonder if I might trouble you for some water for my horse and myself." "I can pay." Vera rose from her chair, studying him with eyes that had learned to judge character quickly. She saw no threat in him, only the bone-deep tiredness of a man who had been riding long and hard. "No need for payment," she said, moving toward the well. "Water's free to any who need it." As she worked the pump, filling a bucket for his horse, the stranger dismounted with the careful movements of someone who had spent long hours in the saddle. Up close, she could see the quality of his clothes beneath the trail dust, the silver threading through his hair that caught the last rays of sunlight. "Much obliged." "Ma'am," he said, guiding his horse to the trough. "Name's Mitchell." "Mitchell Cord." "Vera Campbell," she replied, noting the strength in his handshake. "You're welcome to rest a spell if you've a mind to." Mitchell's eyes, she noticed, were the deep blue of winter sky, and they held a kind of sadness that spoke to her own recent sorrows. When he smiled, it transformed his weathered features, revealing the handsome man he must have been in his youth. "That's kind of you." "Mrs. Campbell, I've been riding since dawn, and I confess your porch looks mighty inviting." As they settled into the chairs, Vera found herself curious about this polite stranger. "You heading somewhere particular, Mr. Cord?" "Just drifting, mostly," he said, and something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. "Looking for honest work, a place to rest my bones for a while." "Work's hard to come by hereabouts," Vera said. "The drought's been rough on everyone." Mitchell nodded, his gaze taking in the struggling garden, the peeling paint, the general air of genteel poverty that hung over the homestead. Yet when he looked at Vera, his expression held no pity, only respect for a woman clearly making the best of difficult circumstances. "Smells like something wonderful's cooking," he observed. Vera felt a flush of pleasure at the compliment. "Just stew, nothing fancy. But there's plenty if you'd care to stay for supper." She surprised herself with the invitation. She rarely had company anymore, and certainly not mysterious strangers. But something about Mitchell Cord's manner put her at ease. Perhaps it was the careful way he spoke to her, neither presumptuous nor overly familiar. Or perhaps it was simply the loneliness of too many solitary meals. "I wouldn't want to impose," Mitchell said, though his eyes showed genuine interest. "No imposition at all," Vera assured him. "It's been a while since I've had someone to cook for." As the evening star appeared in the deepening sky, they sat companionably on the porch, sharing the kind of comfortable silence that sometimes develops between strangers who recognize kindred spirits in each other. Tomorrow would bring its own concerns, but for now, Vera Campbell found herself grateful for unexpected company and the simple pleasure of human conversation as darkness settled over the prairie. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when the sound of wheels on gravel announced an unwelcome visitor. Vera looked up from feeding the chickens to see a black buggy approaching, its occupant's rigid posture visible even from a distance. Her heart sank as she recognized Harrison Steele's distinctive profile, sharp-featured and humorless. Like a hawk surveying potential prey, Mitchell emerged from the barn where he'd spent the night, hay clinging to his shirt. After their pleasant evening of shared stew and gentle conversation, Vera had offered him the barn for shelter, and he'd accepted with quiet gratitude. Now he stood watching the approaching buggy with an expression she couldn't quite rid. Harrison Steele climbed down from his buggy with the mechanical precision of a man who measured every movement for its effect. At 35, he possessed the kind of pale indoor complexion that spoke of hours spent hunched over ledgers rather than working under an honest sun. His black suit was immaculate despite the dusty road, and his thin mustache was waxed to sharp points. "Mrs. Campbell," he said, his voice carrying the false courtesy of a man conducting unpleasant business. "I trust you're well this morning." Vera wiped her hands on her apron, buying herself a moment to steady her nerves. "Well enough, Mr. Steele. What brings you out so early?" Steele's pale eyes flicked toward Mitchell, taking in the stranger's presence with obvious calculation. "Bank business, I'm afraid. Perhaps we might speak privately. Anything you have to say can be said in front of Mr. Cord," Vera replied, surprised by her own boldness. "He's been kind enough to help with some repairs around the place." The banker's smile grew thinner. "As you wish." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document. "I regret to inform you that your account has fallen substantially behind. The bank requires immediate attention to this matter." Vera's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the paper. The official language seemed to swim before her eyes, but the meaning was clear enough. She had 30 days to settle her debt or face foreclosure proceedings. 30 days. The words came out as barely a whisper. "The board has been more than patient. Mrs. Campbell, your late husband's debts, combined with your own recent difficulties, have created an untenable situation." Mitchell stepped forward, his movements deliberate and controlled. "What's the amount owed?" Steele's eyes narrowed as he studied the stranger more carefully. "I hardly think that concerns the amount," Mitchell repeated, his voice carrying an edge that made Steele step back involuntarily. $847, the banker said, his tone defensive. "Plus accumulated interest and fees." Naturally, Vera felt the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. It might as well have been $8,000 for all her ability to raise such a sum. Samuel's medical bills, the poor harvests, the cost of maintaining the property alone. It had all added up like water filling a well, drop by drop until suddenly she was drowning. "Mrs. Campbell has options." "Of course," Steele continued, his manner brightening with false helpfulness. "The bank would be willing to discuss alternative arrangements. There are parties interested in acquiring property in this area for development." Development. Vera found her voice again, though it sounded strange to her own ears. "Progress, Mrs. Campbell. Willow Bend won't remain a sleepy frontier town forever. Those with vision see opportunities where others see only hardship." Mitchell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And what kind of opportunities might those be?" Steele waved a dismissive hand. "Mining interests primarily. There's talk of mineral deposits in the surrounding hills. Of course, such ventures require substantial landholdings to be profitable. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire." Vera understood now why her neighbors had been selling out one by one, why property that had been in families for generations was suddenly changing hands. "I'm not interested in selling," Vera said, her voice stronger now. "This land belonged to my husband. It belongs to me. Sentiment is admirable, Mrs. Campbell, but it won't satisfy the bank's legitimate claims. I encourage you to consider your position carefully. 30 days isn't long, and winter will be here before you know it." After Steele's departure, Vera sank into one of the porch chairs, the foreclosure notice still clutched in her hands. The morning that had begun with such simple promise now felt heavy with dread. Mitchell settled into the chair beside her, his presence oddly comforting. "There might be ways to raise the money," he said quietly. Vera shook her head. "I've got nothing left to sell except the land itself, and that's what they're really after anyway." She looked out over the property Samuel had loved so dearly. "Maybe it's time to face facts. Maybe I'm just being stubborn." "Sometimes stubborn is what keeps a person going," Mitchell replied. "Your husband built this place himself?" "Every board and nail," Vera said, pride warming her voice despite everything. "He had such plans for this land. We were going to raise cattle, grow old together watching the sunset from this very porch." Her hand moved unconsciously to the ring hanging beneath her dress. "Sounds like a good man. The best I ever knew." She turned to study Mitchell's profile. "What about you, Mr. Cord? You ever build something you weren't willing to give up?" Something flickered across Mitchell's features. Regret, perhaps, or old pain carefully hidden. "I've built things," he said. "Not all of them worth keeping." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally Mitchell spoke again. "That barn roof needs work before the rains come. I could fix it if you're willing to let me stay on a while. Won't cost you anything but meals and a place to sleep." Vera looked at him with surprise. "You'd do that? A stranger's troubles shouldn't be your concern." "Maybe I'm tired of drifting," Mitchell said. "Maybe it's time I did something worthwhile." There was something in his voice that suggested deeper currents, stories he wasn't ready to tell. But Vera found herself trusting this weathered stranger who had appeared at her door just when desperation threatened to overwhelm her. "I can't pay you proper wages," she warned. "Didn't ask for wages. Asked for a chance to help." As they shook hands on their agreement, Vera felt the first spark of hope she'd known since Samuel's death. Perhaps she couldn't solve her problems alone, but maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to. That afternoon, as Mitchell climbed onto the barn roof with hammer and nails, Vera watched from the kitchen window and wondered what stroke of providence had brought this stranger to her door. She didn't know that 30 miles away, in a mansion that commanded views of 3 counties, Harrison Steele was writing a very different kind of letter, one that would set forces in motion neither she nor Mitchell could yet imagine. The foreclosure notice lay folded on her kitchen table, a stark reminder that 30 days was all the time she had left to save everything Samuel had built. But for the first time since receiving it, Vera Campbell began to believe that miracles might still be possible. The sound of hammer on nail rang out across the homestead like a steady heartbeat, reassuring and purposeful. From her kitchen window, Vera watched Mitchell work on the barn roof with an efficiency that surprised her. Most drifters she'd known possessed a casual approach to labor, but this man moved with the precision of someone accustomed to seeing tasks through to completion. "Hand me those shingles, would you?" Mitchell called down as she approached with a pitcher of cool water. Vera gathered an armload of the weathered cedar shakes, noting how Mitchell's hands, though calloused from honest work, bore the subtle signs of a man who hadn't always made his living with hammer and nails. His fingers were long and well-shaped, his nails clean despite the morning's labor. "You've done this before," she observed as he fitted each shingle with practiced ease. "A time or two," Mitchell replied, accepting the water gratefully. Man learns all sorts of things when he's willing to work for his keep. As the days passed, their conversations during shared meals revealed layers to both their characters. Mitchell spoke little of his past, but his questions about the land, the town, and its people showed a keen intelligence and genuine interest. He listened when Vera shared memories of Samuel, never interrupting or offering empty platitudes, simply allowing her the comfort of remembering aloud. Samuel always said this valley would be perfect for cattle ranching, Vera mentioned one evening as they sat on the porch after supper. The grass used to grow thick as carpet before the drought hit. He dreamed of running 100 head across those hills. Mitchell's gaze followed hers across the parched landscape. "Good grazing land from what I can see. The drought won't last forever. Sometimes I wonder if I'm fooling myself, trying to hold on to dreams that died with him." Vera's voice carried the weight of lonely nights and unanswered questions. "Dreams don't die easy," Mitchell said quietly. "Sometimes they just need different hands to tend them." There was something in his tone that made Vera look at him more closely. In the gathering twilight, his profile seemed almost aristocratic, the kind of bearing that spoke of education and refinement. Yet he wielded tools with the competence of a man born to labor. Their working relationship settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mitchell proved remarkably capable with repairs that had been beyond Vera's strength or skill. He mended the leaning fence posts, repaired the pump mechanism at the well, and reinforced the chicken coop against predators. More than once, Vera caught herself wondering what circumstances had brought such a capable man to wander the territory alone. "You mentioned you were looking for work," she said one morning, as they worked together in the struggling garden. "Surely a man with your skills could find steady employment somewhere." Mitchell's hands stilled momentarily over the tomato plants he was staking. "Sometimes steady employment comes with complications a man prefers to avoid." Before Vera could pursue that intriguing comment, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Two riders approached at an easy pace. Sheriff Briggs, accompanied by a younger man Vera recognized as Jake Morrison, whose family owned the spread adjacent to hers. "Morning, Vera," Tom called out, his eyes already assessing Mitchell with professional interest. "Heard you had some help around the place." "Tom Briggs." "Jake Morrison, this is Mitchell Cord," Vera said, noting how Mitchell stepped slightly forward, positioning himself protectively without seeming obvious about it. Jake Morrison was a pleasant young man of perhaps 30, with sun-bleached hair and the easy smile of someone who had never known real hardship. His family's ranch had prospered even during the drought, thanks to superior water rights and shrewd business practices. "Pleasure to meet you," Jake said, dismounting to shake Mitchell's hand. "Any friend of Mrs. Campbell's is welcome in these parts." Mitchell's handshake was firm but brief. "Much obliged." Sheriff Briggs remained mounted, his experienced eyes taking in details with the thoroughness of a man who had learned not to take strangers at face value. "You planning to stay in the area long, Mr. Cord?" "Depends on how long Mrs. Campbell can tolerate my company," Mitchell replied, with just enough humor to deflect the underlying suspicion. After some general conversation about weather and local concerns, Jake turned to Vera with obvious reluctance. "Mrs. Campbell, I hope you won't take offense, but I wanted you to know, if you ever decide this place is too much to handle alone, my family would be interested in making a fair offer." Vera felt her spine stiffen. "That's kind of you, Jake, but I'm not looking to sell." "Of course not," Jake said quickly, his face reddening. "I just meant, with the bank situation and all, well, sometimes it helps to know you have options." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Vera realized that her financial troubles were already common knowledge around Willow Bend, probably thanks to Harrison Steele's loose tongue. "The bank situation will work itself out," she said firmly. Though her confidence was mostly bravado, after the visitors departed, Mitchell continued his work without comment. But Vera noticed a new tension in his shoulders. That evening, as they shared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, he finally spoke. That young Morrison seemed friendly enough. "Jake's a good boy," Vera agreed. "His family's always been decent neighbors who happen to want your land." Vera set down her fork, studying Mitchell's expression. "You think there's more to it than neighborly concern?" "I think when word gets around that a woman's in financial trouble, it draws all kinds of interest, not all of it neighborly." The truth of that observation settled over them like evening shadows. Vera had lived in Willow Bend long enough to understand how quickly gossip traveled and how rapidly vultures could circle when they sensed weakness. "I can take care of myself," she said. But even to her own ears, the words lacked conviction. Mitchell's blue eyes met hers across the table. "I know you can, but there's no shame in accepting help when it's freely offered." Something in his voice made her pulse quicken, a gentleness that spoke of genuine caring rather than mere politeness. For the first time since Samuel's death, Vera found herself noticing the way lamplight played across a man's features, the quiet strength in capable hands. The warmth that could exist between two people who had found unexpected companionship. "Why are you really here, Mitchell?" she asked softly. "A man with your skills, your education, you could make your way anywhere. Why stay to help a widow you barely know?" Mitchell was quiet for so long that Vera wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of careful honesty. "Maybe because helping you feels like the first worthwhile thing I've done in a long time." Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the cottonwoods. Samuel had planted their first spring on the land. Inside, two people who had found each other by chance began to discover that some meetings might be something more than mere coincidence. The kitchen felt warmer somehow, with Mitchell sitting at the old wooden table, sleeves rolled up as Vera guided his hands through the delicate process of making her mother's biscuits. His fingers, she noticed, were surprisingly gentle as he worked the dough, following her patient instructions with the careful attention of a man unaccustomed to domestic arts. "Don't overwork it," Vera cautioned, her hand briefly covering his to demonstrate the proper pressure. The contact sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "My mother always said tough biscuits were the mark of an impatient cook." Mitchell's chuckle was warm and genuine. "Can't say I've had much practice with patience in the kitchen. Most of my meals have come from campfires and whatever could be cooked in a single pot." "Well, a man should know how to make proper bread," Vera said, retrieving her mother's worn recipe book from its place of honor on the shelf. The leather binding was cracked with age, and many pages bore the stains of countless cooking sessions. "This book has every recipe my mother ever treasured. She gave it to me when I married Samuel." Mitchell accepted the book with reverence, understanding its significance. As he turned the yellowed pages, Vera found herself sharing stories that came with each recipe. Her grandmother's apple butter, the Christmas cookies that had filled their house with the scent of cinnamon and cloves, the wedding cake recipe that had been used for 3 generations. "Sounds like you come from a family of fine cooks," Mitchell observed, pausing at a page marked with dried flower petals. "Food was love in my family," Vera replied, feeling the familiar pang of missing her mother's voice, her gentle hands teaching patience and care. "Mother always said you could tell the character of a woman by how she fed her family." As the biscuits baked, filling the kitchen with their golden aroma, Mitchell spoke more freely about his travels than he had before. He described sunrise over the Colorado mountains, the vastness of Texas rangeland, the busy streets of Denver, where fortunes were made and lost in the span of a single day. "You've seen a lot of country," Vera observed, pouring fresh coffee into their cups. "Too much, maybe," Mitchell said, and something in his tone suggested weariness that went deeper than mere travel fatigue. A man can spend so much time moving that he forgets what it feels like to belong somewhere. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of horses and raised voices from the direction of town. Through the kitchen window, they could see Sheriff Briggs approaching at a gallop, his face grim with purpose. "Vera!" Tom called out as he reined in his horse. "Need to speak with you and your friend here." They met him on the porch, Vera's heart already racing with apprehension. Tom's usual easy manner had been replaced by the serious demeanor of a lawman conducting official business. "What's wrong, Tom?" Vera asked. "Had some folks in town asking questions about Mr. Cord here," the sheriff said, his eyes fixed on Mitchell. "Seems there's some confusion about his background." Mitchell's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, becoming more alert without appearing defensive. "What kind of questions?" "Harrison Steele's been making inquiries. Claims he's received reports about a stranger matching your description. Someone who might not be entirely forthcoming about his circumstances." Vera felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What exactly is Mr. Steele suggesting?" Tom's weathered face showed reluctance to continue. "He's wondering if maybe Mr. Cord here isn't exactly what he appears to be. Whether his interest in this property might not be entirely charitable." The accusation hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Vera felt anger rise in her chest, hot and protective. "That's ridiculous, Tom. Mitchell's done nothing but help me. He's been a perfect gentleman. I'm not making accusations, Vera, just passing along concerns that have been raised." Tom's tone was careful, diplomatic. "In my position, I have to take such reports seriously." Mitchell stepped forward, his movements controlled and deliberate. "Sheriff, I understand your concerns. I'm exactly what I appear to be, a man looking for honest work and a place to rest for a while. If my presence here is causing trouble for Mrs. Campbell, I'll move on." "No," Vera said quickly, surprising herself with the vehemence of her response. "You're not going anywhere because of Harrison Steele's insinuations. This is my property, and I decide who's welcome here." Tom studied both their faces, his experienced eyes reading the undercurrents of emotion. "Vera, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. If you vouch for Mr. Cord, that's good enough for me. But I'd advise caution. Steele's not a man to cross lightly." After the sheriff departed, Vera and Mitchell stood on the porch in the gathering dusk, both affected by the confrontation in different ways. Vera felt shaken by the realization that their growing friendship was already the subject of town gossip and bankers' schemes. "I'm sorry," Mitchell said quietly. "I never intended to bring trouble to your door." "You haven't brought anything but help and kindness," Vera replied firmly. "Harrison Steele's the one bringing trouble, and he started long before you arrived." They settled into the porch chairs, but the easy companionship of earlier felt strained. Mitchell seemed withdrawn, lost in thoughts he didn't share. Vera found herself studying his profile in the lamplight that spilled from the kitchen window, noting again the quality of his bearing, the way he held himself like a man accustomed to command. "Mitchell," she said softly, "whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, it doesn't matter to me. Not unless you want it to." He turned to look at her then, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression, a loneliness that matched her own. "Some things matter whether we want them to or not," he said. "Some truths have a way of catching up, no matter how far a man travels." Before she could ask what he meant, Mitchell rose from his chair and moved to the porch railing, his hands gripping the weathered wood. "There's something you should know about me, Vera, something that changes things." Her heart began to race. "What is it?" Mitchell turned back to her, and in his eyes she saw the weight of a secret that had grown too heavy to carry alone. But before he could speak, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention once more. This time it was Jake Morrison, riding hard and looking agitated. Whatever news he brought, Vera sensed it would only complicate an already uncertain situation. The evening that had begun, with flower-dusted hands and gentle laughter, now felt charged with unspoken tensions and approaching storms. Jake Morrison's horse was lathered with sweat, and the young man's usually cheerful demeanor had been replaced by obvious distress. He dismounted quickly, his eyes darting between Vera and Mitchell with barely concealed agitation. "Mrs. Campbell, I'm sorry to bother you so late," Jake began, his voice tight with concern. "But I thought you should know. There's been talk in town. About you and—" He glanced nervously at Mitchell. "About your situation here." Vera felt her patience wearing thin. First Harrison Steele's veiled threats, then Sheriff Briggs with his diplomatic warnings, and now young Jake Morrison, bringing more unwelcome gossip from town. "What kind of talk, Jake?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Some folks are saying it's not proper, you having a stranger staying on the property. Unmarried woman, unmarried man. You know how people are." Jake's face reddened with embarrassment. "Mrs. Patterson's been particularly vocal about it." Mitchell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps it would be better if I moved on." "No," Vera said sharply, surprised by her own vehemence. "I won't be dictated to by town gossips and busybodies. This is my land, my home, and my decision." As Jake rode away with obvious relief at having delivered his unwelcome message, Vera turned to find Mitchell watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The evening air seemed charged with unspoken tensions. "You don't have to defend me," Mitchell said quietly. "These people are your neighbors. You'll have to live with them long after I'm gone. Will you be gone?" The question slipped out before Vera could stop it, revealing more than she'd intended about her growing attachment to his presence. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on the porch railing as he stared out at the darkening prairie. "I don't know," he said finally. "I came here looking for something, though I'm not sure I knew what it was until I found it." The following Saturday brought the monthly town social, a gathering at the church hall that served as one of Willow Bend's few community events. Vera had attended every social since moving to the valley, but tonight she felt nervous as she smoothed her best dress and checked her appearance in the mirror one final time. Mitchell had brushed his travel-worn clothes and made an effort to tame his silver-streaked hair. When he offered his arm to escort her, Vera felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced since her courting days with Samuel. The church hall buzzed with conversation that seemed to quiet as they entered together. Vera held her head high, her hand resting lightly on Mitchell's arm, determined not to show how the sudden attention affected her. Mrs. Patterson, the storekeeper's wife and unofficial keeper of community morals, approached with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Why, Vera dear, how lovely to see you. And this must be your guest." "Mitchell Cord," he said, tipping his hat with impeccable courtesy. "Ma'am." The older woman's sharp eyes took in every detail of his appearance, the quality of his boots, the silver watch chain visible beneath his vest, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. "Mr. Cord," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "And what brings you to our little community?" "Work and rest, ma'am. Mrs. Campbell has been kind enough to provide both." Throughout the evening, Vera was acutely aware of the glances and whispered conversations that followed their movements. Some were merely curious, but others carried the sharp edge of judgment. When the fiddle music began and couples took to the dance floor, Mitchell surprised her by asking for her hand. "I'm not much of a dancer," he admitted, as they moved to the music's gentle rhythm. "You're doing fine," Vera replied, conscious of his hand at her waist, the way he guided her steps with natural grace that belied his claim of inexperience. As they danced, Doc Henley approached the edge of the dance floor, his weathered face showing the kind of thoughtful concentration that meant he was puzzling through something important. When the music ended, the elderly physician drew Mitchell aside. "Might I have a word, Mr. Cord?" Doc's tone was polite but insistent. Vera watched nervously as the two men stepped onto the church's front porch. Through the open windows, she could hear the murmur of their voices but couldn't make out the words. Doc Henley had been practicing medicine in this territory for 30 years. He knew everyone who mattered within 100 miles. When they returned, Mitchell seemed subdued, and Doc Henley wore the carefully neutral expression of a man keeping professional secrets. Whatever had passed between them, it had clearly affected them both. The ride home was quieter than usual, with Mitchell lost in thoughts he didn't share. As they approached the homestead, Vera finally broke the silence. "Doc Henley seemed to recognize you." Mitchell's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. "Did he?" "Mitchell, if there's something you need to tell me—" "There is," he said quietly, bringing the buggy to a stop in front of the house. "But not tonight. Some conversations need daylight and clear heads." That night, Vera lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind churning with questions and uncertainties. Through her bedroom window, she could see the faint glow of lamplight in the barn where Mitchell had made his quarters. She wondered what secrets he carried, what past he was running from, and whether the growing feelings between them could survive whatever truth was coming. In the barn, Mitchell sat on the edge of his makeshift bed, turning a silver pocket watch over in his hands. The engraved initials on its case caught the lamplight MC, along with a family crest that would be recognized by anyone familiar with the territory's most powerful ranching dynasty. He'd been a fool to think he could hide forever, that he could find peace in anonymity and honest work. But these weeks with Vera had shown him something he'd forgotten could exist: genuine affection, untainted by knowledge of his wealth and power. For the first time in years, someone had looked at him and seen not the feared cattle baron Mitchell Cord, but simply a man willing to work for his keep. Tomorrow he would have to tell her the truth. Tonight he would hold on to the illusion a little longer, the sweet pretense that love could exist without the complications of fortune and reputation. The silver watch ticked steadily in his palm, counting down the hours until everything would change. The morning dawned grey and heavy, with clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen of the conversation Vera sensed was coming. Mitchell had been unusually quiet during breakfast, his coffee growing cold as he stared out the kitchen window toward the distant hills. "You said we needed to talk," Vera said finally. Unable to bear the tension any longer, Mitchell nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against the table's worn surface. "There are things about me, about my past, that you deserve to know." Before he could continue, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. Through the window, they watched Doc Henley approach at a steady pace, his black medical bag bouncing against his horse's flank. "Morning, folks," Doc called out as he dismounted, but his usual cheerful demeanor seemed forced. "Vera, I wonder if I might have a word with Mr. Cord here, privately." Vera looked between the two men, sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. "Of course, Doc, I'll just—" "No," Mitchell said quietly, his voice carrying a note of resignation. "Whatever Doc Henley has to say, you should hear it too." The elderly physician studied Mitchell's face for a long moment before nodding. "Very well. Mrs. Campbell, what do you know about your guest's background?" "I know he's a good man who's helped me when I needed it most," Vera replied, her voice defensive. "Beyond that, I haven't pried into his private affairs." Doc Henley's withered hands worked at his hat brim. "Vera, this man isn't who he's claimed to be. His name might be Mitchell Cord, but he's not some drifting cowhand looking for work." Vera felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "What do you mean?" "I mean Mitchell Cord owns more land in this territory than any other single man. He's the cattle baron, whose holdings stretch from the Colorado border to the Yellowstone River. Half the businesses in 3 states answer to him in one way or another." The words hit Vera like a physical blow. She turned to look at Mitchell, searching his face for denial, for some explanation that would make sense of this impossible revelation. "Is it true?" she whispered. Mitchell's blue eyes met hers, and she saw confirmation in their depths, along with something that might have been shame. "Yes." The simple word hung between them like a chasm opening in the earth. Everything she thought she knew, every moment of growing closeness, every shared laugh and gentle touch, all of it suddenly felt like a lie. Why? The question came out as barely a breath. Mitchell rose from his chair, moving to the window, as if he couldn't bear to see the pain in her eyes. "Because I was tired of people who only saw my money. Tired of women who wanted to marry my fortune rather than know the man behind it. I needed to find out if anyone could care for Mitchell the man, not Mitchell the empire. So you lied to me." Vera's voice was steady, but Doc Henley could see her hands trembling. "I never lied about who I am inside," Mitchell said, turning back to face her. "Everything between us, every conversation, every moment of understanding that was real." Vera stood slowly, her movements careful and controlled. "You let me feed you my last plate of food. You watched me worry about losing my home, about not having money to pay my debts. All the while, you could have solved my problems with pocket change. It wasn't about the money. It was always about the money." The words exploded from her with years of pent-up frustration and fresh betrayal. "You have so much you can't even see what it means to have nothing. You turned my desperation into some kind of test." Mitchell stepped toward her, his face stricken. "Vera, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" "How you've been amusing yourself by playing at being poor. How you've been watching me struggle while sitting on enough wealth to buy this entire valley." Doc Henley cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps I should leave you two to—" "No, Doc," Vera said, her voice hardening. "You've done what you came to do. Thank you for telling me the truth, something Mr. Cord here seems incapable of." As if summoned by the intensity of their voices, another rider appeared on the horizon. This time it was Harrison Steele, approaching at a leisurely pace that suggested he was in no hurry and very much in control of the situation. "Mrs. Campbell," the banker called out as he dismounted. "I trust this morning finds you well? And Mr. Cord, or should I say Mr. Mitchell Cord of the Cord Cattle Empire?" The silence that followed was deafening. Steele's thin smile grew wider as he took in the tableau before him. Vera's stricken face, Mitchell's defensive posture, Doc Henley's obvious discomfort. "I see the truth has finally come to light," Steele continued smoothly. "I must admit, I suspected something was amiss when my inquiries about our mysterious drifter kept hitting walls. Imagine my surprise to discover that Mrs. Campbell has been harboring one of the territory's most influential men. What do you want, Steele?" Mitchell's voice carried an edge of command that hadn't been there before, the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Nothing from you, Mr. Cord. My business remains with Mrs. Campbell." The banker's pale eyes fixed on Vera with predatory intensity. "I trust this revelation doesn't change your financial circumstances?" "The bank's deadline remains in effect." Vera lifted her chin with quiet dignity. "My circumstances haven't changed at all. Mr. Steele, I still owe the bank money I don't have, and I still have no intention of selling my land." "How refreshing to see such independence," Steele said mockingly. "Of course, now that your guest's true identity is known, people might wonder about other arrangements that have been made. The territory has very specific laws about property transfers and, shall we say, undue influence." The threat was clear, even wrapped in legal language. Vera understood that any help from Mitchell would now be seen as suspicious, possibly fraudulent. Her brief hope that his wealth might somehow solve her problems evaporated like morning dew. "I think we understand each other." "Mr. Steele," she said quietly, after the banker's departure. The three remaining on the porch stood in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Doc Henley gathered his reins and prepared to leave. "Vera," he said gently, "sometimes the truth hurts before it heals. Don't make decisions while the wound's still fresh." But Vera had already made her decision. As Mitchell stepped toward her, she held up a hand to stop him. "I think you should go," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Pack your things and leave my property." "Vera, please, go, Mitchell. Before I say something we'll both regret." 3 days passed in unbearable silence. Vera moved through her daily routines with mechanical precision, tending to chores that seemed endless without Mitchell's capable hands to help. The barn roof he'd repaired stood as a constant reminder of his presence, while the kitchen felt too large and too quiet for one person's footsteps. On the 4th morning, as storm clouds gathered overhead, Doc Henley returned. This time his manner was different, urgent, almost secretive. He glanced around the property as if checking for unwelcome observers before dismounting. "Vera, we need to talk," he said without preamble, "about Mitchell Cord and why he really came here." "I don't want to hear any more about Mitchell Cord," Vera replied. But something in Doc's tone made her pause in her work. "You need to hear this," Doc insisted. "I should have told you everything the first time, but I thought it might work out differently." Despite herself, Vera found her resistance weakening. "What are you talking about?" Doc removed his hat and ran weathered fingers through his grey hair. "Mitchell didn't just happen to stop at your door, Vera. He came here deliberately, but not for the reasons you think." "Then why?" "Because Harrison Steele's been working for him." The words hit Vera like a physical blow. She sank onto the porch steps, her mind reeling with the implications. "What do you mean, working for him?" 3 months ago, Mitchell learned that Steele had been systematically acquiring properties throughout the valley, using questionable methods to force people into foreclosure, then buying their land for a fraction of its worth. When Mitchell investigated, he discovered that Steele was using the Cord name and reputation without permission, claiming he had backing for mineral development schemes. Vera's hands clenched into fists. "So Mitchell knew about my debt all along?" "He knew Steele was targeting your property specifically. What he didn't know was you, the woman who'd shown him kindness without any expectation of reward." The storm that had been threatening finally broke, sending the first heavy drops of rain across the dusty yard. Doc Henley moved to the porch for shelter, but Vera remained where she sat, letting the rain soak through her dress. "You're saying this whole thing, my foreclosure, the threats, everything, it's all been some kind of business scheme?" "Worse than that. Steele's been using falsified documents, claiming mineral rights that don't exist, convincing Eastern investors to fund his land acquisitions. He needed large holdings to make his scheme credible. And your property sits right in the middle of the area he's been targeting. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of multiple horses approached through the rain. Vera looked up to see Harrison Steele leading a group of men she didn't recognize. Well-dressed city types with the soft look of men who made their living with paper and ink rather than honest labor. "Mrs. Campbell," Steele called out, seemingly oblivious to the rain soaking his expensive suit. "I'd like you to meet some associates of mine from Denver. Gentlemen, this is the property I was telling you about." One of the Eastern men dismounted and approached the porch, his calculating eyes taking in every detail of the homestead. "The mineral surveys confirm significant deposits?" "Absolutely," Steele said smoothly. "The geological reports are very promising. Of course, we'll need to begin extraction operations immediately to meet our timeline." Vera rose slowly, water dripping from her hair and clothes. "I haven't agreed to sell anything to anyone. Mrs. Campbell," Steele's voice carried a new edge of impatience, "your debt comes due in 2 weeks. Unless you've miraculously acquired $800, you'll have no choice in the matter." "Show them the surveys, Steele," Doc Henley said suddenly, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone turn to look at him. "I beg your pardon." Steele's face flushed with irritation. "The geological surveys you've been showing your investors. I'd be very interested to see them, considering I happen to know that no official mineral surveys have been conducted in this area for over 5 years. The silence that followed was broken only by the steady drumming of rain on the porch roof. Steele's pale eyes darted between Doc Henley and his nervous-looking investors. "I hardly think a frontier physician is qualified to evaluate geological—" "You're right," Doc interrupted, "but the Territorial Mining Authority might be, especially since I took the liberty of wiring them about your activities." One of the Eastern men stepped forward, his face darkening with suspicion. "Steele, what is this old man talking about?" Before the banker could respond, another rider appeared through the rain, this time Mitchell Cord, mounted on a powerful black stallion and accompanied by Sheriff Briggs and 2 men wearing federal marshal badges. Mitchell dismounted with fluid grace, his presence seeming to fill the space around them. Gone was any pretense of being a simple drifter. This was clearly a man accustomed to command, to having his orders followed without question. "Harrison Steele," one of the marshals said formally, "you're under arrest for mail fraud, falsification of federal documents, and conspiracy to defraud investors." Steele's face went white, then flushed with desperate anger. "You can't prove anything. These people invested willingly, based on forged mineral surveys and falsified claims of backing from the Cord Cattle Company," Mitchell said, his voice cold as winter wind. "I never authorized the use of my name or my company's reputation for your schemes." As the marshals placed Steele in custody, the Eastern investors clustered together in angry confusion, their get-rich-quick dreams dissolving in the prairie rain. Sheriff Briggs supervised the proceedings with the satisfied air of a man seeing justice done. Through it all, Vera stood frozen on her porch, trying to process the rapid sequence of revelations. When the law enforcement contingent finally departed with their prisoner, she found herself alone with Mitchell and Doc Henley. "So none of it was real," she said quietly. "The debt, the foreclosure, all of it was just part of Steele's scheme." "The debt is real," Mitchell said gently, "but it was manufactured through inflated interest rates and fabricated fees. The legitimate amount you owe is less than $200. "Which you could pay without blinking," Vera said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Mitchell stepped closer, rain dripping from his hat brim. "Vera, I know how this looks. I know you think I orchestrated everything, but I swear to you, meeting you, getting to know you." Falling in, he stopped himself, perhaps realizing that declarations of love would ring hollow in the current circumstances. "You fell in what, Mitchell?" Vera asked, though her tone suggested she didn't really want to hear the answer. "In love with you," he said simply. "Completely, helplessly in love with a woman who showed me kindness when she thought I had nothing to offer in return." The rain continued to fall, washing away the dust of deception, but leaving behind questions that couldn't be so easily cleansed. Vera looked at Mitchell, really looked at him, and saw not the wealthy cattle baron or the mysterious drifter, but a man who seemed as lost and uncertain as she felt. "I don't know what's real anymore," she whispered. "This is real," Mitchell said, gesturing between them. "Whatever else was false or complicated or wrong, what we found together was real." But even as he spoke the words, Vera wondered if love built on deception could ever truly survive the weight of revealed truth. The week following Steele's arrest passed in a strange suspension of time. Vera found herself caught between relief that the immediate threat to her home had been removed and a deeper confusion about everything she thought she understood about her life. The reduced debt, a manageable sum that no longer threatened foreclosure, should have brought peace. Instead, it left her feeling adrift, uncertain of her own judgment and the motives of everyone around her. Mitchell had respected her request for space, but his presence lingered everywhere. She saw him in the expertly repaired barn roof, in the straight fence posts he'd reset, in the kitchen where he'd learned to make her mother's biscuits with careful, gentle hands. The memory of his touch, his laugh, the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her, all of it felt tainted now by the knowledge of his deception. Doc Henley visited daily, ostensibly to check on her well-being, but clearly serving as an unofficial messenger. Through him, she learned that Mitchell had taken rooms at the hotel in town, that he was personally ensuring the legal resolution of Steele's fraudulent activities, that he asked after her health but made no demands for her attention. "He's been meeting with lawyers all week," Doc reported on Thursday morning as they sat on the porch with coffee, "making sure every family Steele cheated gets proper restitution. The Morrison boy's father will get back the 100 acres he lost last spring. The widow Jenkins won't lose her house after all." Vera absorbed this information in silence, unsure whether it made her feel better or worse about Mitchell's role in recent events. "He loves you, you know," Doc said gently. "I've seen a lot of people in my years, Vera. I know the difference between a man protecting his interests and a man protecting his heart. How can I trust anything he says now?" Vera asked, voicing the question that had kept her awake for days. "How do I know what was real and what was just part of his investigation?" "Because I watched him those weeks he was here," Doc replied. "I saw a man discover something he hadn't expected to find. The way he looked at you when he thought no one was watching, that wasn't the look of a man conducting business." That afternoon, as Vera worked in her garden, she noticed unusual activity on the road leading to town. Several buggies and riders passed by, all heading in the same direction, with a sense of purpose that suggested significant news. When Mrs. Patterson's distinctive voice called out from the general store wagon, Vera looked up from her tomato plants. "Vera, dear, have you heard?" The storekeeper's wife was practically vibrating with excitement. "There's to be a meeting at the bank this afternoon. Something about Mr. Cord making an announcement regarding the Steele situation." Vera's stomach clenched with anxiety. "What kind of announcement?" "Nobody knows for certain, but there's talk he's planning to make some kind of grand gesture. You know how these wealthy men can be, always needing to make a show of their generosity." After Mrs. Patterson continued toward town, Vera found herself unable to concentrate on her gardening. Whatever Mitchell was planning, it involved her somehow. She could feel it in the way the townspeople looked at her with a mixture of pity and anticipation. As evening approached, Jake Morrison rode up to her gate with the kind of urgent energy that suggested important news. His usual easy smile was replaced by concern and something that might have been admiration. "Mrs. Campbell, I thought you should know what happened at the bank today." Vera set down her watering can, bracing herself for whatever revelation was coming. Mr. Cord called a meeting with everyone who'd been affected by Steele's schemes. He had a pile of documents, deeds, contracts, debt papers, started reading off names and amounts, making restitution to every family that had been cheated. "That's good of him," Vera said carefully. "When he got to your name, though," Jake paused as if struggling to find the right words. "He didn't just forgive the fraudulent parts of your debt, Mrs. Campbell. He forgave all of it, every penny. Then he did something else." Vera's heart began to race. "What?" He transferred the full deed to your property into your name, free and clear. No mortgage, no liens, no conditions. He said, Jake's voice grew soft with wonder. He said it was payment for services rendered, that you'd provided food and shelter to a stranger when you had precious little to spare, and that such kindness deserved to be rewarded. The words hit Vera like a physical blow. She sank onto her porch steps, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Mitchell had done. Her home, her land, everything Samuel had built, it was truly hers now, secured forever against the threats that had haunted her dreams. There's more, Jake continued gently. Sheriff Briggs said Mr. Cord's leaving town tomorrow, heading back to his main ranch up north. He settled all his business here and made it clear he won't be returning. That night, Vera sat alone on her porch, staring out at land that was now unquestionably hers. The deed lay on the table beside her, crisp and official, bearing Mitchell's signature in bold, confident strokes. Samuel's wedding ring hung heavy around her neck, a reminder of the love she'd known and lost. While her heart struggled with feelings that seemed to pull her in impossible directions, she thought about the man who had knocked on her door that evening weeks ago, asking only for water and a place to rest. The man who had learned to make biscuits in her kitchen, who had listened to her stories about Samuel without judgment, who had fixed her roof and mended her fences as if they were his own. Had any of that been real, or had it all been an elaborate performance? But even as doubt plagued her thoughts, she remembered moments that seemed too genuine to be false, the way Mitchell's hands had trembled slightly the first time he'd touched hers, the vulnerability in his eyes when he'd spoken of finding something worthwhile to do, the careful reverence with which he'd handled her mother's recipe book. Sometimes the truth hurts before it heals, Doc Henley had said. Perhaps the real truth wasn't simply that Mitchell had deceived her, but that they had both been seeking something neither had been able to name until they found it in each other. As the clock in her parlor chimed midnight, Vera made a decision that surprised her with its certainty. She rose from her chair, lit a lantern, and began walking toward town. The road was empty at this hour, the only sounds her footsteps on packed earth and the distant cry of a night bird. By the time she reached the hotel, the building was dark, except for a single light burning in an upstairs window. Mitchell's room, she was certain. Tomorrow he would be gone, and with him any chance to understand what had been real between them and what might still be possible. She stood in the street below his window, her lantern casting a small circle of light in the darkness, and wondered if some kinds of courage were worth the risk of having one's heart broken twice. The photograph of Samuel that sat on her dresser at home seemed to whisper encouragement. Her first husband had been a man who believed in taking chances on love, in building something lasting from hope and honest effort. Perhaps it was time to discover whether she had inherited more than just his land. Perhaps she had inherited his faith in the possibility of new beginnings, even when the path forward seemed uncertain. The light in Mitchell's window flickered, and Vera saw a shadow move across the glass. Tomorrow would be too late for conversations that might change everything. If she was going to take this chance, it had to be now, in the honest darkness of a prairie night, with nothing but her courage and the hope that some truths were worth the risk of believing in them. The hotel lobby was dark and silent, but Vera knew the proprietor kept a key behind the front desk for late arrivals. Her hands shook as she climbed the narrow stairs, each step creaking in the midnight stillness. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet building, and she paused halfway up, her heart racing with the enormity of what she was doing. A respectable widow didn't visit a man's hotel room in the middle of the night, regardless of her feelings or the circumstances that had brought them to this point. But respectability seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford. Tomorrow, Mitchell would be gone, riding north to his empire and his previous life, and she would be left with nothing but questions and regrets. If she was going to find the courage to speak her heart, it had to be now. At the top of the landing, she paused before the door, where lamplight still glowed beneath the frame. For a moment, She allowed herself to imagine what lay beyond that door, not just the simple hotel room, but the possibility of a future she had barely dared to consider. Then, before she could lose her courage, she knocked softly. The footsteps inside were immediate, as if Mitchell had been pacing rather than preparing for sleep. When the door opened, she saw him still fully dressed, his shirt wrinkled and his silver hair disheveled as though he'd been running his hands through it. His usually composed demeanor had been replaced by the look of a man wrestling with his own demons. Vera. Her name came out as barely a whisper. His blue eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. "May I come in?" He stepped back wordlessly, gesturing her into the small room. A single lamp cast warm light over sparse furnishings. A narrow bed, a washstand, a chair where his traveling clothes were neatly folded. On the bedside table lay the silver pocket watch that had first made her suspicious, its engraved surface catching the lamplight. Beside it were several documents that looked like business correspondence, reminders of the world he would return to. The room felt smaller with both of them in it, charged with unspoken tensions and possibilities. Vera was acutely aware of the impropriety of her presence here, but also of the rightness of it. Some conversations couldn't wait for daylight and proper chaperones. "I heard about what you did at the bank today," Vera said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. Mitchell nodded, moving to stand by the window as if needing distance between them. His reflection showed in the dark glass, a man caught between worlds, the wealthy cattle baron and the simple cowhand who had found peace in her kitchen. "You deserve to own your land free and clear. Samuel built something good there. It shouldn't be lost to bankers' schemes and legal complications. That's not why you did it." He turned to face her, and in his expression she saw all the careful masks stripped away, leaving only raw honesty. The lamplight cast shadows across his features, emphasizing the lines that spoke of years of responsibility and decision-making, but also revealing the vulnerability he usually kept hidden. "No, it's not." "Then why?" Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, his hands gripping the windowsill as he seemed to struggle with how much truth to reveal. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of loneliness and careful self-protection. "Because I love you," he said simply. "Because in all my years of building an empire, of accumulating wealth and power, I never found anything as valuable as sitting on your porch, sharing supper and conversation. Because you gave me the last of your food when you thought I was nobody, and that kind of generosity deserves to be protected." Vera felt tears threaten, but she blinked them back. "You could have told me the truth from the beginning. Could I?" Mitchell's voice carried years of bitter experience. He moved away from the window, beginning to pace the small space like a caged animal. "How many women do you think have professed love for Mitchell Cord, the cattle baron? How many have seen my holdings and my bank accounts instead of seeing me? I'm not those women. I know that now," he said quietly, stopping his pacing to look directly at her. "But I didn't know it then. I came here to investigate Steele's activities. Yes, but I stayed because for the first time in years, someone looked at me and saw a man worth knowing rather than a fortune worth marrying." Vera studied his face, seeing the pain behind his words. "Tell me about them. The women who hurt you." Mitchell's laugh was bitter. "Where do I begin? There was Catherine Whitmore in Denver. Beautiful, cultured, everything a wealthy rancher should want in a wife. I courted her for 6 months before discovering she was already spending my money in her head, planning how to redecorate my house and reorganize my business. When I suggested we start with a simple life on one of my smaller properties, she looked at me like I'd suggested we live in a cave." He sat heavily in the room's single chair, his elbows on his knees. "Then there was Victoria Hayes, a banker's daughter from San Francisco. She seemed different at first, intelligent, independent. But during our engagement, I learned she'd been corresponding with business rivals, sharing information about my operations in exchange for promises of social advancement after our marriage." "How long ago?" Vera asked softly. "Victoria?" 3 years. Long enough that I should be over it, but..." He shrugged. "After a while you start to wonder if There's something fundamentally unlovable about who you are. Underneath all the trappings, Vera felt her heart break a little for this man who carried so much responsibility and had learned to trust so little. And so you decided to test me. Not consciously at first. I really did just need a place to rest, and you offered kindness when I needed it most. But as the days passed, as I got to know you, yes, I suppose I was testing whether your feelings would change when you learned the truth about my circumstances. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Vera moved closer, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped his knees. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now I go back to my ranch up north. I run my business and try to forget what it felt like to be happy." His smile was sad and self-deprecating. "You go on with your life, secure in the knowledge that your home is safe. Maybe someday you'll remember me fondly, the strange drifter who helped fix your roof. Is that what you want?" Mitchell was quiet for so long that Vera wondered if he would answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "What I want is impossible." "Why?" "Because I lied to you. Because I let you worry about money while I had enough to solve your problems 100 times over. Because I watched you struggle and used your hardship to test whether your feelings were genuine." He turned away from her again. "How could you ever trust me after that?" Vera moved closer, close enough to place her hand gently on his shoulder. She felt him tense at her touch, but he didn't pull away. "You want to know what I think?" He nodded without looking at her. "I think you're a man who's been hurt before, who learned to protect himself by keeping people at a distance. I think when you found something real, something worth keeping, you didn't know how to trust it." Her hand moved to cover his, her fingers intertwining with his. "I think you're not the only one who's been afraid." Mitchell turned at her words, his eyes searching her face. "Afraid of what?" "Of loving someone again. Of risking my heart when I'd convinced myself it was safer to live with memories than to make new ones." Vera's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "After Samuel died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I'd had my chance at happiness, and that trying again would somehow dishonor his memory. And now I think Samuel would have understood exactly why you tested my feelings, not because he was suspicious, but because he knew how precious true love is, how worth protecting. He spent 26 years proving his love to me every day. He would want me to find someone who would do the same." Mitchell stood slowly, his hands reaching for hers. "Vera, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we try to build something together, it won't be simple. I have enemies, business rivals who wouldn't hesitate to use you against me. I have responsibilities that sometimes take me away for weeks at a time. My world is complicated in ways that your life with Samuel never was. Are you trying to scare me away? I'm trying to be honest about what you'd be choosing." Vera stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of green in his blue eyes, the silver threading through his hair that caught the lamplight. "Mitchell, do you think I'm some delicate flower who can't handle complications? I've been running a homestead alone for 2 years. I've faced down bankers and gossips and drought and the loneliness of wondering if I'd ever feel whole again. I'm stronger than you think. I know you are. That's one of the things I love about you. Then stop trying to protect me from making my own choices." Her hands moved to frame his face, feeling the roughness of day-old beard, the warmth of skin that had been weathered by years under the sun. "I'm not those other women, Mitchell. I don't want your money or your empire or your grand gestures. I want the man who learned to make biscuits in my kitchen. I want the man who fixed my roof and listened to my stories about Samuel without jealousy or impatience. I want Mitchell, not his money or his reputation or his complicated world, just Mitchell." For a moment, they stood frozen in that tableau, two people balanced on the edge of a decision that would change everything. Then Mitchell's control finally broke, and he pulled her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of weeks of careful restraint, finally giving way. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "I love your strength and your kindness, and the way you see good in people, even when they don't deserve it. I love the way you make ordinary moments feel like blessings. The way you honor your past, while still being brave enough to reach for a future. I love you too, Vera replied, her voice muffled against his chest. I love the way you work with your hands, even though you could hire others to do it. I love the way you listen when I talk about Samuel, never trying to compete with a memory, but understanding that my past is part of who I am. I love the way you make me feel like I'm worth cherishing, not just enduring. They held each other in the lamplight of the small hotel room. Two people who had found their way to each other through deception and truth, through testing and faith, through the kind of love that could survive even the weight of revealed secrets. In the golden lamplight of the small hotel room, with midnight silence surrounding them. Two people who had found love in the most unexpected circumstances stood on the threshold of deciding whether their future would be built on trust or lost to fear. The choice was theirs now, and tomorrow would reveal whether love could indeed conquer the complications that wealth and deception had created. Mitchell's hands came up to frame her face with infinite gentleness, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. In his touch, Vera felt all the careful restraint he'd maintained since that first evening on her porch. The respect, the longing, the deep tenderness of a man who had learned the difference between wanting someone and truly cherishing them. "You would forgive me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything?" "I would forgive us both," Vera replied, her hands covering his. "For being afraid, for protecting our hearts when they'd been broken before, for not trusting that love could be simple and honest, even when everything else seemed complicated." The kiss that followed was nothing like the tentative brush of lips they'd shared on her porch weeks ago. This was the kiss of two people who had found each other across the vast landscape of loneliness and loss, who had tested the strength of their connection and discovered it could survive even the weight of revealed secrets. When they finally broke apart, Mitchell rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "I don't deserve you." "Deserve has nothing to do with it," Vera said firmly. "Love isn't about deserving, it's about choosing. And I choose you," Mitchell cawed, "not your money or your land or your grand gestures. Just you." He pulled back to study her face, searching for any hint of doubt or reservation. "You're certain?" "Because once we do this, there's no going back. I won't be able to pretend I don't love you more than everything I've built." "Good," Vera said with a smile that transformed her face. "Because I'm tired of pretending that I can live without you." They talked through the night, their voices soft in the lamplight, as they shared stories they'd never told anyone else. Mitchell spoke of the loneliness that had driven him to test people's motives, of business partnerships that had crumbled when money became more important than trust, of women who had seen his wealth as a prize to be won rather than understanding the man who had earned it through years of honest labor. Vera told him about the long nights after Samuel's death, when she'd wondered if she would ever feel whole again, about the fear that accepting help meant admitting defeat. But the way her heart had started to heal the moment he'd asked for nothing more than water and a place to rest. "I keep thinking about that first evening," Mitchell said, his arm tightening around her as they sat together on the narrow hotel room bed. "You had every reason to turn me away, a stranger asking for charity when you barely had enough for yourself. But you didn't hesitate. My mother always said kindness was the one thing that cost nothing but was worth everything," Vera replied. "Besides, you reminded me of Samuel in some ways. Not in looks, but in the way you carried yourself. Like a man who'd known hard work and understood its value. What would he think of us now, do you suppose?" Vera was quiet for a moment, considering. "He'd be happy for me. Samuel believed that life was meant to be shared, that joy doubled when you had someone to celebrate with, and sorrow halved when you had someone to help carry the burden. He wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life alone, just to honor his memory." The morning sun found them still talking, still making plans and promises, still marveling at the simple miracle of finding each other. As dawn light crept through the hotel window, they heard the sounds of Willow Bend awakening, merchants opening shops, horses being hitched to wagons. The ordinary business of a frontier town beginning another day. I should go, Vera said reluctantly, though she made no move to leave his arms. We should go, Mitchell corrected gently. Together, face whatever gossip or questions are waiting, but face them as a united front. They walked down Main Street hand in hand as the town stirred to life around them. Vera was acutely aware of the glances and whispered conversations that followed their progress, but for the first time she found she didn't care what others thought. Let them talk. She had found something worth any amount of gossip or speculation. Doc Henley was the first to intercept them, emerging from his office with a broad grin that suggested he'd been expecting this development. Well, I see sanity has finally prevailed. Morning, Doc, Mitchell said, his arm tightening protectively around Vera's waist. About time you two came to your senses, the elderly physician declared. Half the town's been taking bets on whether you'd work things out. And the other half? Vera asked with amusement. The other half's been planning your wedding, Doc replied with a chuckle. Mrs. Patterson's already started making a list of what needs to be done. She's appointed herself chief organizer, whether you want her help or not. As if summoned by his words, Mrs. Patterson appeared from the general store, her sharp eyes taking in their joined hands and the obvious change in their relationship with calculating interest. Behind her came several other townspeople, drawn by the unusual spectacle of the territory's wealthiest rancher, walking openly through their small town with the local widow. Well, I never, she declared, though her tone suggested she'd expected exactly this outcome. Vera Campbell, you might have consulted with those of us who care about your reputation before what, Mrs. Patterson? Mitchell's voice carried a quiet authority that made the older woman step back. Before she chose to marry the man who loves her more than his own life. The word marry hung in the morning air, like a bell that had been rung, impossible to take back. Vera looked up at Mitchell with surprise and joy, seeing in his eyes that the proposal was real, not just a convenient way to silence gossips. Is that what you're doing? She asked softly. Asking me to marry you? Mitchell stopped walking and turned to face her fully, apparently oblivious to the growing crowd of townspeople who had gathered to witness this unexpected drama. In the morning light, he looked younger somehow, the stern lines of the cattle baron softened by genuine emotion. Vera Campbell, he said, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the woman who shared her last plate of food with a stranger? The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever, though it probably lasted only seconds. Vera was aware of Doc Henley's encouraging nod, of Mrs. Patterson's barely contained excitement, of Jake Morrison's approving smile from where he stood outside the bank. She was aware of Sheriff Briggs tipping his hat respectfully and several ranch hands who had stopped their horses to witness the proceedings. But mostly she was aware of Mitchell's eyes, blue as winter sky and full of hope and love and the promise of shared tomorrows. Yes, she said, her voice ringing clear across the morning air. Yes, Mitchell cawed, I will marry you. The cheer that went up from the assembled townspeople could probably be heard 3 counties away. Mrs. Patterson immediately began making plans aloud. Doc Henley produced a flask for an impromptu toast, and even the usually reserved Sheriff Briggs was grinning broadly. As the excitement swirled around them, Mitchell drew Vera into his arms once more, his kiss sealing the promise they had made to each other in words. When they finally broke apart, both were laughing, with the pure joy of 2 people who had found their way home to each other despite all the obstacles that had stood in their path. When? Vera asked, still breathless from his kiss and the enormity of what they had just decided. Tomorrow, if you'll have me, Mitchell replied, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. I've waited long enough to make you my wife. I don't want to waste another day. Tomorrow seems perfect, Vera agreed, thinking of Samuel's ring that hung around her neck and knowing that her first husband would approve of this new beginning. Some loves were meant to last a lifetime, and others were meant to teach you that the heart could love again, deeper and truer than before. As the crowd began to disperse, full of excitement and wedding plans, Mitchell and Vera remained standing in the middle of Main Street, holding each other and marveling at how much their lives had changed since that dusty evening when a stranger had knocked on her door asking for water. 6 months later, the afternoon sun cast golden light across the valley as Vera stood in her kitchen, their kitchen now, kneading dough for the evening's bread. Through the window, she could see Mitchell working with a small crew to expand the barn, his sleeves rolled up and his movements sure and confident. He had simplified his vast business empire, delegating most operations to trusted managers while focusing on what truly mattered: the land they shared and the life they were building together. The homestead bore the marks of their partnership. The house had been lovingly restored, its white paint fresh and bright against the prairie sky. New shutters framed the windows, painted the soft blue of morning sky. The garden flourished under Mitchell's careful irrigation system, fed by a new well he'd had drilled. Rows of vegetables stretched in neat lines, and fruit trees that would provide for future harvests had been planted along the property's edges. But the changes went deeper than mere improvements. There was a sense of completion here now, of a place where two hearts had finally found their home. The parlor held new furniture that Mitchell had ordered from Denver, comfortable chairs arranged around a stone fireplace he'd built for the coming winter. But Vera's favorite additions were the small touches that spoke of their blended lives. Samuel's photograph in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, her mother's china displayed in the new cupboard Mitchell had crafted, and the 2 coffee cups that sat permanently on the kitchen table, symbols of their daily ritual of sharing morning conversation over steaming cups. "Something smells wonderful," Mitchell said, appearing in the kitchen doorway with hay clinging to his shirt and satisfaction written across his weathered features. "Your favorite," Vera replied, rising on her toes to kiss him despite the flour on her hands. 6 months of marriage had only deepened their appreciation for these simple moments, the daily rhythms of shared work and gentle affection that made a house into a home. Their wedding had been a simple affair, held in the church with Doc Henley officiating and the entire town in attendance. Vera had worn her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit, while Mitchell had surprised everyone by arriving in a simple black suit rather than the expensive clothing his wealth could have provided. They had exchanged vows they wrote themselves, promising to build a life based on honesty, respect, and the kind of love that grew stronger through shared adversity. The honeymoon had been spent right here on the homestead, working side by side to plan improvements and establish new routines. Mitchell had insisted on learning every aspect of running the property, from milking Bessie to tending the chickens to maintaining the vegetable garden. In return, he had taught Vera about the broader aspects of ranching, how to read the land for the best grazing, how to plan for seasonal changes, how to build something lasting that could weather any storm. "The new fence posts are set," Mitchell continued, washing his hands at the pump. "Tom Morrison sent word that he's ready to discuss that cattle partnership whenever we are." Vera smiled at the mention of their neighbor. The Morrison family had been among the first to welcome Mitchell openly into the community, recognizing his genuine desire to be a good neighbor rather than simply the wealthy outsider. Jake Morrison had become something of a friend, often stopping by to discuss ranching techniques and share local news. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the front yard, where Doc Henley was arriving with his familiar black bag bouncing against his horse's flank. But today he wasn't alone. Sheriff Briggs rode beside him, both men wearing the kind of pleased expressions that suggested good news. "Afternoon, you two," Doc called out as they dismounted. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important. Just bread making," Vera said, wiping her hands on her apron as they gathered on the porch. "Though I suspect you didn't ride all the way out here just to check on my baking." Tom Briggs removed his hat and settled into one of the porch chairs with obvious satisfaction. The chairs had been Mitchell's wedding gift to Vera, 4 sturdy rockers he'd commissioned from the town's carpenter, designed to last for decades of evening conversations and lazy afternoon visits. Actually, we came to share some news about the steel situation, Tom continued. Thought you'd want to hear it from us, rather than through town gossip. Mitchell joined them, his arms settling naturally around Vera's waist. The gesture had become automatic over the months, a physical reminder of their partnership that still sent warmth through her chest every time. What news? Federal court handed down the final sentences yesterday, Tom continued. Steele got 10 years in territorial prison. His Eastern accomplices got various terms, but the important thing is they're all paying full restitution to everyone they cheated. Justice served, Doc added with approval. And thanks to Mitchell's testimony and documentation, every family in the valley is getting back what was stolen from them. Plus, interest. The Jenkins widow won't lose her house after all. The Morrison family got back their 100 acres, and 3 other families can rebuild what they thought was lost forever. Vera felt a deep sense of satisfaction at this news. The wounds Steele had inflicted on their community were finally healing, and families could rebuild their lives without the shadow of his schemes hanging over them. Mitchell had spent weeks working with federal investigators, providing evidence and testimony that ensured justice was thorough and complete. There's more, Tom said, his eyes twinkling with barely contained amusement. Jake Morrison asked me to pass along a message. His family is planning to expand their operation, and they want to know if you'd be willing to partner with them on a cattle venture. Seems they've got respect for your business sense, Mitchell, and they trust Vera's judgment about character. Mitchell and Vera exchanged glances, a whole conversation passing between them in that look. They had discussed their future plans many times during their evening conversations on the porch. Dreams of building something together that honored both Samuel's memory and their own hopes for the future. Tell Jake we'll ride over tomorrow to discuss details, Mitchell said. But yes, we're interested. This valley's been good to us. It's time we invested in making it prosper for everyone. After their visitors departed, they settled into their porch chairs as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The valley spread before them in shades of gold and green, peaceful and prosperous once more. In the distance, cattle grazed on grass that had recovered from the drought, and the sound of their lowing carried on the evening breeze like a song of contentment. Vera reached for Mitchell's hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. Do you ever regret it? She asked suddenly. Regret what? Giving up your empire to play house with a frontier widow? Mitchell's laugh was warm and genuine. My dear wife, I didn't give up an empire. I traded it for something infinitely more valuable, a real home, a true partnership, and the love of a woman who sees me for who I am, rather than what I own. He pulled her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her wedding ring. The simple gold band had been their choice together, not the elaborate diamond he could easily have afforded, but something that spoke of their values and the life they wanted to build. Besides, he continued, we didn't give up anything. We just learned to value the right things. I still have my business interests, still provide employment for hundreds of people across the territory. The difference is that now I come home to something that matters more than all of it combined. As if to emphasize his point, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a letter that had arrived that afternoon. Speaking of business, I received word from my lawyer in Denver. The charitable foundation we discussed is officially established. We'll be able to help struggling homesteaders throughout the territory, provide low-interest loans, and support for families facing difficulties like the ones Steele created. Vera felt a swell of pride at this news. The foundation had been her idea, born from her own experience of nearly losing everything to predatory schemes. Mitchell had embraced the concept enthusiastically, seeing it as a way to use his wealth for genuine good, rather than simply accumulating more. What will we call it? She asked. The Samuel Campbell Foundation for Frontier Families, Mitchell replied softly. I thought your husband should be honored for the principles he lived by, honesty, hard work, and taking care of your neighbors. Tears pricked Vera's eyes at this thoughtful tribute. Mitchell had never shown jealousy toward Samuel's memory, instead honoring the man who had loved her first and shaped the woman Mitchell had fallen in love with. "He would have liked that," she said softly. "And he would have liked you, Mitchell. You're both men who understand that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in the lives you touch and the good you do." As darkness settled over the prairie, they remained on the porch, sharing comfortable silence and the knowledge that they had found what so many spend their lives searching for: a love built on honesty, respect, and the quiet miracle of two hearts choosing each other against all odds. The kitchen lamp cast warm light through the windows, and somewhere in the house, the clock Samuel had built chimed the hour. But Vera no longer counted time in terms of loss and loneliness. Now each hour was measured in shared laughter, gentle touches, and the sweet certainty that tomorrow would bring more of the same simple blessings. "You know what the best part is?" Mitchell asked as they finally rose to go inside. "What's that?" "We're just getting started," he said, pulling her close for one more kiss under the star-filled sky. "We have the rest of our lives to build something beautiful together." Hand in hand, they walked into their home, into their shared future, into the rest of their lives together. Behind them, the valley stretched in peaceful darkness, protected and prosperous, a testament to what could be accomplished when love was built on the solid foundation of truth, respect, and the courage to trust again. In the morning, they would begin planning their cattle venture with the Morrison family. They would review applications for the foundation's first grants. They would tend their garden and mend their fences and share breakfast at the table Samuel had built, but Mitchell had made into a symbol of their partnership. But tonight, they were simply a man and woman who had found each other across the vast landscape of the American frontier, who had tested their love against deception and pride and emerged stronger for the trial. Tonight they were home,